We have done it. You're listening to episode 90
90
of the D6 podcast.
Here's the encouragement I give you. The shortest distance between your child's heart, your grown child's heart, and Christ is you.
Parents need to own that they are the primary disciplers of their child.
Our goal in parenting is not for our kids ultimately to get a great education, as good as that is. Our goal is not for them to be great athletes. Our goal is not for them to go on great dates and find a great husband or a great wife. Our goal is not for them to have a great career with a great job, making great money. Our goal is for them to love a great God.
You're listening to the D6 podcast. Here's your hosts, Ron Hunter and Jeremy Lee.
This is the family ministry podcast that helps you connect the church and home. How are we doing today, Mr. Ron?
Doing very, very well. I'm looking forward to our guests. In fact, I can't wait to share one of the bios.
I went back and listened to our tease from last episode, and we were giddy about this episode.
We were. This is this is kind of the geek moment, giddy, but I want people to get past I want them to get past all the little hype about it and realize the incredible value content that they're about to hear.
So here's what I'm excited about.
Okay.
I think, all the way, y'all can go back to episode 1 and listen to the promises we've made. One of the promises we made was that everything was going to be transferable as possible. Mm-hmm. Second thing we said is we are going to introduce you to the best family ministry leaders in the world. What that means is if you will keep listening to us, you will know who out there is sharing your passion for family ministry. That's what we're going to do today. Now, a lot of you, I bet, have heard of Larry Fowler if you've been listening for a long time. But our first guest, Vern Bengtson, is going to be, for most of you, a new name, but it is a name you need to know. He has quite literally spent his entire life doing research for what we do every day. And
you know how we came about Vern Bengtson? Do you know the backstory on this, Jeremy?
Let's share it.
I got a call from Sean McDowell, a friend of D6, and, quite an accomplished person all of his own. He is all the time sharing people he's bumping into, people he knows, people he uses in his teaching as a professor at Biola. And he says, Ron, are you aware of Vern Bengtson? I said, no, tell me about him. And he began to tell me this bio. And just like if I were sitting in our listeners' shoes, I'd be going, this sounds boring. Because, and I know Dr. Bengtson's about to be listening, but I know he probably gets this. When you read his bio, and Sean started telling me about this, he says, okay, Ron, cut past the bio. He said, imagine following a family for 40 years and just tracking how they pass on their faith and values. A family? That would be tough to follow a family. Imagine following 20 families. I can't imagine who has time to track 20 families over 40 plus years watching how they pass on their faith and values. Dr. Bengtson has spent his life following hundreds of families, the same families over nearly 45 years.
It's priceless research.
It is.
Guys, if we aren't doing a good enough job, listen to this. The New York Times profiled this man and what he did, and listen to what he's researching. He's researching faith development and the passing of faith down generations, and specifically how faith families do it. And it's not all just Christian. He works with Jewish families and some other stuff like that. But there's a point in this interview. I just need to make sure we all are listening for this, where he shares his own faith moment, where God became real to him. And so interesting when he slid into the interview chair. I'll never forget it. I don't know if he was wearing a cardigan or a turtleneck, but he should have been. He's like that guy that, should be by. You just go ahead and picture him by like a fireplace and with a cup of coffee in his hand and like
a contemplative thought.
Just imagine the smartest guy you've ever seen. This guy. And so I'm sitting here thinking we are about to talk about theory and statistics. This is when I'm going to get my nap, And then all of a sudden he just speaks. And when he begins to speak of God whispering to his heart in the middle of a church service, while he was doing his research, by the way, he did not start his research in his own words in a close connection to God. And in the process of that, God whispered to his heart. And as he told that story, tears came down his cheeks. And I said, I'll never forget it. So that's why I'm giddy about this interview. Can't wait to jump into it. But let's also talk a little bit about Larry Fowler as well, because another man who's just changed the game.
He has. I believe that Larry Fowler, you said it last week, the guy has achieved so much in his lifetime, and at the point that he should be coasting, backing off, and resting, he's decided to make a valuable space for grandparents.
Pioneering and trailblazing.
Yes, opening up a new way to look at grandparenting. And this is a group that often does not realize their own value, and he's providing self-value that they can then pour into others around them.
Yes.
And I think you're going to walk away today just really, really with some, as you say, transferable ways you can start helping your seniors think differently about their position in life.
And get ready. We're going to spin some yarn on grandparent ministry later in the show. But for now, let's jump into the interview with Vern Bengtson. Dr. Bengtson, you are going to enjoy him after the break. We'll start with that.
Have you ever left a conference so excited to download what you've learned, but when you start to talk, no one gets it? When you pull out your notes, no one responds the way you envisioned? D6 Days is a free 2-day online event designed to help you share the same vision, passion, and learning experienced at the D6 conference. Because when we share things effectively, momentum builds exponentially, and D6 Days is a convenient opportunity for you to share with everyone, your staff, volunteers, and church family. During the event, you'll hear from around 30 voices in family ministry and generational discipleship. The team at D6 provides this free because we want every person who's committed to generational discipleship to be equipped regardless of their budget. And we've crafted an online environment where we can interact and engage with you. Whether you are in the comfort of your home, at the office, or watching D6 Days over coffee. Join us February 12th and 13th for D6 Days 2018. To sign up, go to d6days.com.
Hey, everybody. We are here today with Mr. Vern Bengtson. How are you, sir?
I am just fine.
I don't think I need to say, sir. Do you have do you have letters after your name, or are you a Dr. Bengtson?
I'm a doctor.
Okay.
I'm
then, hey,
father,
you worked for that.
I'm a grandfather.
You prefer those titles
I like
better?
those titles more, yeah.
Oh, that's good. How many grandchildren do you have?
4.
Wow, that's good. All right, well, then let me get all this official stuff out of the way, right? So everybody knows to be impressed by you. Here we go. He's a research professor of gerontology at the Roybal Institute of Aging at the University of Southern California, a past president of Gerontological Society of America. He had to help me with all this, by the way. He helped me spell it out. He has published 17 books and 250 research articles on families, aging, and intergenerational relationships. His latest book, Families and Faith, How Religion Is and Isn't Passed Down Across Generations, has won numerous awards and been featured in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Goodness gracious.
And all my grandchildren are above average.
Which, again, huge accomplishment. But you need to be here at D6. I mean, everything you are talking about, thinking about, writing about is what we're thinking about. So welcome, sir. I'm glad
Thank you very
have
much.
You here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Your research is as credible as we're going to find today. And specifically on our topic. But let's start with this. We're going to talk about how religion is and isn't passed down across generations, the subject of your book. How in the world did you get to the place where your research in your new book is the result of decades? I would just love to understand how you can collect data over decades. What was that process like?
Well, you have to have a lot of patience. You have to be extraordinarily stubborn. And maybe some people have suggested I haven't had a new idea since 1960. But I started straight out of graduate school at the University of Chicago. And I wanted to do a study that looked at the relationship between mental health and family intergenerational relations. And that was just at the start of the decade of protest, and the Vietnam War and psychedelic and drug epidemics was starting. So I wanted to see how much there was, in fact, difference between parents and kids, and I added the grandparent generation just kind of like an afterthought. So I looked at attitudes and behaviors, mental health, physical health, and just as an afterthought, I stuck in some scales measuring religion, attendance, affiliation, religious intensity, religious beliefs. And that study became a 45-year longitudinal study because it was supported by the National Institutes of Mental Health. And they were very much interested in the relationship between family dynamics and mental health. But I didn't look at the data on religion until about the year 2000, after we'd had several rounds of data gathering. And then I looked to see which of the many scales, the many dimensions we were measuring, showed the greatest degree of similarity across generations. And I was looking at depression, I was looking at anxiety, I was looking at physical and other mental health measures, including attitudes about politics and women's roles and so forth. And lo and behold, it were the 4 religious dimensions that seemed to indicate strongest intergenerational similarity.
Wow.
And I thought, what's that about? You know, why would religion would hang around across generations more than some of these other dimensions? So I got another grant from the National Institutes of Health to look at intergenerational similarity of religion and its relation to mental health. And that's what came out in this book.
Wow. That is, I guess my thing is, what I heard you just say is, it surprised you a little.
It surprised me a great deal. And it also surprised a lot of people in the secular world.
I'm interested in that. Tell me about that.
Well, the findings of this book caused a lot of attention. There was an article, a review in the Wall Street Journal, for example, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. A lot of national television programs picked it up. The first surprising finding was that faith transmission is a lot stronger between generations than is commonly assumed. About 7 out of 10 of the families in our sample showed faith transmission between generations. The second really surprising thing was that since we have data from 1970 and data from 2005, we could compare the degree of faith transmission over those 35 years. And despite all the cultural change in those 35, 40 years, the degree of faith transmission was the same. It hasn't declined in this fast-changing culture. That was a real surprise, and we hear so much about the decline of the family, about the fact that families are in poor shape, that there's a generation gap in religious values. Well, our data, collected using the best of social science methods, suggest that those are stereotypes that are not true. And then there was a third finding that nobody was prepared for, and that had to do with the role of the father in faith transmission. We looked at the characteristics that were most predictive of whether transmission of faith occurred or not. And of course, we looked at issues like whether the parents were involved in a church, whether the parents had prayer with their kids, and so forth. The thing that most strongly predicted whether the child followed in the footsteps of the parent was the father's warmth, the father's relationship, whether there was a close relationship that was perceived by the child with the father. And that just blew me away. I had no idea that the father's emotional parenting was so important in faith transmission.
Just so people are understanding, there's no bias here. You weren't coming at it from necessarily. You weren't trying to be a faith-based person proving this faith-based phenomenon. You weren't looking for this.
Absolutely not. In the first place, this is a social science study that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. It was medically based. It went under peer review, really rigorous scientific methods. The data looked like this.
Yeah, you were showing that to me earlier. I was like, huh?
In the second place, I was what we call in this book a religious rebel. My daddy was a preacher, but I fell away from the family faith in my 20s and 30s. And at the time I began this inquiry into the religious data that we had been collecting, I was an atheist or an agnostic.
Oh my goodness.
So definitely there was no intent to promote a pro-Christian or pro-religious agenda when I began looking at the data on intergenerational transmission of religion.
Which absolutely gives this more credibility to the folks that would leverage it in their ministries. Okay, you're blowing my mind here, but in the New York Times article, you said you went for 35 years. Now, as part of this process, you said the denominational loyalty is down. Talk to us about that. What did you mean by denominational loyalty being down?
Okay, in our study, we looked at 5 dimensions of religious behavior and beliefs. One of those dimensions was the church that one belongs to, church membership. You know, Southern Baptist versus Presbyterian versus Episcopalian versus non-denominational. That was less true to be transmitted across generations than the other 4 dimensions. Religious intensity. How religious would you say you are? How important is religion in your life? That's a second dimension we measured. A third was how often do you attend services of any kind? How often do you practice your religion? A fourth was what are your religious beliefs? This was a checklist of various kinds of beliefs. Fifth is how important is religion in society, in American society? Should there be religion? Should religion be taught in schools, for example? So we had 5 different dimensions. In 4 of those dimensions, there was a high degree of intergenerational similarity, intergenerational transmission, but not in terms of denominational loyalty. There was much more a sense of shifting across generations between parents and children.
That's beautiful. Now, there's a quote from the article. It's a little lengthy, but I just need to read it. It was so good. It says, but Professor Bengtson's major conclusion is that the family bonds matter. Displays of parental piety, like teaching the right beliefs and practices and keeping strictly to the law, can be for naught if the children don't feel close to the parents. Without emotional bonding, these other factors are not sufficient for transmission. He writes, this one of my favorite discoveries you've made in your research. You're telling me, I'm sorry. I'm now not reading the quote anymore. I'm reading my thoughts. This is one of my favorite discoveries you've made in your research. You're telling me that it's not just parents sharing faith, but parents need to have a real relationship with their kids in addition for faith to actually be shared.
That's true. And that's hard to teach our parents. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you teach a dad to back off, be less rigid, be more affirming, be less of a disciplinarian? It's hard. That's harder than to say to him, you've got to pray with your kids every night. You've got to read the Bible with them every morning. But it's so fundamental to the kind of identity formation, the kind of transference that's useful if you want to have a child that emulates you.
What other factors help to explain why some parents are successful in passing on their faith while others are not? Are there anything else in your research?
Of course, setting an example by doing rather than just saying. A second factor that came out again and again, being consistent. Kids pick up hypocrisy so quickly. And if there's inconsistency there between what a father or mother says and what a father or mother does, a kid will ferret it out, and they just do not like that. So those are two things that are real clear.
That's good. You said in your information you got some interesting information on prodigals.
Yes.
What'd you discover with them?
Well, in a number of our families of highly religious parents, there are instances in which a child was not of the same faith or who had no faith at all. And because we could follow these individuals over time, over a period of 35 years, we could see what happened to these prodigals. And one of the messages of our data is that prodigals do come back. So if your child is rebelling religiously, if your child has dropped away from the faith, don't lose heart. In our sample, the kids that came back talked about their parents as not closing the door, as remaining open, as not being judgmental, as being warm, affirming, loving. And as it happens, that fits my own story. I was a religious rebel who became a prodigal son coming back. I was 68 years old when my prodigal son turned up at the father's doorstep. Of course, my dad was long dead by then. But another message of our data is that things change with age in terms of one's spiritual life and one's religious life. Prodigals do return, and spiritual development occurs in later life. I had my epiphany in my 68th, 69th year, about 5 years after I had delved into this particular research project. It was Easter Sunday. I hadn't been to church in years. I decided to attend a worship service where I knew there would be good music. I walked into this church. The organ was roaring. The congregation was soaring. The windows were streaming light down through the wonderful glass, and I sat and I cried. God reached out to me in my later years. I was born again. Thank you, God. I mean, it happened. Religiosity, spirituality, changes and develops over the course of life. And because we have data over 35 years, we can see that. Unfortunately, most of our churches don't seem to be aware of that. They have a sort of a one-size-fits-all model for adults. But people in their older years have needs that are spiritually different than people in their 30s and 40s. And there are 75 million baby boomers out there. Most of them grew up in churches but have left. They represent a mission field for our churches. So what are our churches doing to bring them back into church? What are they doing to have a mission for their special needs as their spouses sicken and die, as they face death? For the most part, our churches aren't doing anything. And they should, because this represents a mission field, these seniors, these 75 million baby boomers. I'm sorry for getting off on that.
No, that's beautiful. It's good to think about. Yeah, for sure. I need to talk. I wish we had time for everything, but I need to talk more about this book because I want to make sure, the people listening to this are age-graded ministers, children's ministers, youth ministers, maybe even preschool ministers. And I need to help them understand how they can use this book in your ministry. I think I know, but can you help them understand that?
Well, this is a piece of of scientific research. So it doesn't have a message per se. There's no how-to at the end. That would be inappropriate because that's placing an interpretation on data. And it would be inappropriate because I know this is a multi-faith audience. But I would say that a youth minister reading this book will have more of an appreciation for the diversity of the population of parents out there who are struggling to be the best Christian parent they can. And I think also they will find the different patterns of youth responses to parental attempts to socialize their children in the faith with some degree of appreciation. It's just amazing to me. This is a series of cases, of stories of children and parents in bonds together as they negotiate issues of religion and spirituality through life. And it's just so interesting to see the varieties. One size does not fit all. And we've got to be aware of the individuality with which God has created each unique parent-child bond. And I think that's what I would take away from this.
That's beautiful. If somebody wants to follow up with you or connect with you online, is there a way to do that?
Absolutely. My email address is bengtson@usc.edu.
Awesome. You just gave out your email address. I love it. BENGTSON.
Yes.
At usc.edu.
That's right.
Go Trojans.
Fight on.
Thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure. I really have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
All right.
Scripture and modern-day research attests to this truth. When one generation commits to and engages in the discipleship of another generation, people of all ages know Jesus and become more like him. This commitment requires us to say goodbye to the myopic focus on the next generation and instead broaden our view to every generation. Every generation. Moms, dads, grandmas and grandpas, aunts and uncles, kindergartners and middle school students, college freshmen and newlyweds, each one awakened to Jesus Christ and living out a vibrant faith with one another. We invite you to adopt this focus at the D6 Conference, a family ministry event built on the Deuteronomy 6 philosophy of generational discipleship. You will experience 3 days of strategy, resources, and action steps to help move your church forward together. Discover what's in store at d6conference.com.
Jeremy, great interview. I heard this past week literally that something I wasn't aware of, that in our green room at the D6 conference when he was speaking, that's where speakers who were on deck in the next 30 to 45 minutes, hour. So there's usually 2 or 3 in there, and sometimes the worship leaders will be in there, a couple of staff. When Dr. Bengtson was speaking, the room got quiet, which rarely happens. I mean, it's usually a quiet place generally, but there's chitter chatter, there's talk, there's prep. The guys from production are walking in and out, getting people mic'd up. And when he started, it just got quiet. And I think that goes to, these are high caliber speakers who are then getting quiet listening to what Dr. Bengtson says. And, if you like listening to high caliber speakers, I will tell you, the D6 conference, D6 days, our podcast, this is a place we just keep pouring into other people. And I'm so glad God gives us a chance to talk to these people, to be able to I've learned so much in my own personal life from the conversations I've had in their offices, on these podcasts and these interviews. And the best thing we can do is not keep them to ourselves, but to share them. And D6 Days is another way that our listeners can share something that doesn't cost them anything.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because if you're listening to this as we release the podcast, we are coming up very quickly on D6 Days. You can go to d6days.com to learn more about it. But if you don't know much about D6 Days, it is it's a lot of the interviews that we are showing on this podcast, or we release on this podcast. Well, you get to see the video of it, but then there's also main stage talks, and you just basically get a snapshot of the D6 conference for free online.
It's kind of like an appetizer, February the 12th and the 13th. And this is the time where often people share on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook pictures of their entire team sitting around. They've set up a projector and they've got the large screen showing on a wall inside their church. And they're having a great 2 days of just, camaraderie, learning, debriefing, planning, strategizing. They've created their own war room.
Perfect. That's it. So d6days.com is the place to get set up for that. Totally encourage you to be a part of that. Now let's transition to grandparent ministry. Like I said, I want us to talk a little bit about this, but let's listen to Larry Fowler about the importance of grandparent ministry. Let's take a listen.
We're sitting here with Larry Fowler, who is I call him, he's one of the longtime influencers and children's ministry gurus. Many churches have looked to him for advice. He is the recent founder of the Legacy Coalition, and they are championing grandparenting ministry. So it's very important I tell you that Larry has experience in that area because he has 7 grandkids of his own. Tell me their ages, Larry, as we get started.
They're from 2 all the way to 22. In fact, I have 2 sets. I have a young set and an older set. So I've got the experience of teenagers and toddlers and everything in between.
Wow. Well, welcome to the D6 podcast, Larry.
Thank you.
Here's my question for you. You and I have talked so much about this, and you've got an incredible conference, and at the end, we're going to share your website so people can find out more about what you do. But you and I were talking about 2 or 3 years ago, and you said, Ron, churches do not understand the difference between a seniors ministry and a grandparent ministry. Help our audience know the difference.
Well, there's a couple differences. One is that the age group is not the same. It's not synonymous. Seniors ministry is not the same as grandparenting ministry because the average person in America becomes a grandparent at age 47, according to U.S. Census figures. And so when we say grandparents, Ron, we're actually talking about a whole lot of 40-year-olds as well as 50-year-olds. And in fact, if we said we'd like to do a grandparenting ministry, just like with family ministry, you want to engage parents when they're young. We want to engage grandparents when they're young. So it's a much broader space of time than simply what is normally called the seniors ministry.
That's awesome. So when a church is thinking about this, what if they already have a seniors ministry, but they've never considered grandparenting ministry? What should they begin thinking about first?
Well, I would say think about how you do parenting ministry. Parenting ministry is probably across some age groups. You may have a 20-something, young couples ministry, and you may have 30-something, but parenting crosses that. It's a cross-section of those. Well, so is grandparenting. Grandparenting ministry can run on a parallel track to parenting ministries, but it crosses a number of those age groups.
So when we think about grandparenting ministry and that passing along our faith and values and influence, how do you begin to coach ministry leaders to help coach the grandparents?
Well, I would start by wanting them to really get a good grasp on the potential that there is in grandparents for influence. And that's what's, I think, one reason why there's hardly been a grandparenting ministry in America. Well, when we started our ministry a year and a half ago, that was true. There are now many churches that are considering it and have actually implemented stuff. But I would want them to start by just understanding the potential that grandparents have. And Ron, grandparents are second only to parents in the ability to influence kids. And often they actually exceed that of parents because as they've gotten older in life, they simply care more. So without a passion for it and without an understanding that this thing is really a legitimate discipleship focus, they're probably not going to happen. So I'd want to start there.
Wow. So whenever we recognize the influence of grandparents, you mentioned that it's second only to the parents. We're talking about establishing a young person's worldview, talking about what are their preferences for life. I know in my own family, my wife and I have talked that we have tried to teach our kids certain things, and we've said it over and over and over. And then if grandpa or grandma says it, they're like, oh, did you hear what they had to say? And they seem to remember it so much more. There's real power in the words that grandparents share, isn't there?
Well, there seems to be, because I've heard that story a lot, Ron, over and over and over again. And I'd like to think that my words have that kind of impact on my own grandkids. And of course, that's what we strive for, is to be a big influence in their lives.
So what does a grandparent need to be thinking about with the conversations they have with their grandkids and the activities? I mean, what can they be more intentional about doing?
Well, they can be more intentional. First of all, it is about conversations. And I think one of the most practical things that grandparents can do is with grandkids is to just make sure that you have individual time with them. And then approach that individual time intentionally from a spiritual perspective. And you want to make it enjoyable for the kids. You want to say, what's going on in your life and tell me about your interests. You want to do all that. But grandparents can really have an impact simply by starting conversations, listening, and then when God opens the door, offering advice as well. So often in our families, though, what we do is we may have family time. We may get everybody together for Thanksgiving or Christmas. But how often do grandparents spend individual time alone with grandkids? I think that's one of the primary practices.
Yeah. So I know whenever my wife and I, we sent our kids to their grandparents each summer because they always lived some distance away. The grandparents planned activities. They planned the days.
Yeah.
And, it did not always have to be cost, something they spend a lot of money on. Sometimes just hanging out with the kids was all that they needed, whether it was reading a book, going to the library. What are some other activities that grandparents should consider, even if they're on a limited budget?
Well, we're having more and more grandparents that are doing something like grandpa and grandma camp, or sometimes they'll call it cousins camp if they get them all together. But it is also an extended time. Let the parents go and get a couple days off, and you take the grandkids, and you can recover afterwards. But have a couple days with them, and do it just like a weekend camp with activities and fun and field trips and food and all of that, and then mix in some Bible lessons. You can do that, and we're seeing more and more grandparents do that.
Good deal. Now, you are amassing a lot of grandparents into one location with the Legacy Conference. Tell us about that and the website where people can find out more information for how you're resourcing this ministry as we wrap up.
Well, we're going to do two things. Number one, we're going to continue to have national conferences on Christian grandparenting, and that's a time where the thought leaders on the topic get together and people get a chance to come hear them. But we're also doing something called the Grandparenting Matters Seminars, where we'll come to your church, bring the whole idea of intentional Christian grandparenting to your congregation, to your grandparents. And check it out at our website. Our website is legacycoalition.com.
LegacyCoalition.com. Everybody should go visit that. Check out what Larry's doing. Thank you so much for being a part of the D6 podcast, Larry.
All right. You're welcome, Ron.
So I promised everybody you and I would chat about this because we heard Larry's thoughts. Thank you so much, Larry. He has championed this cause, and I'll never forget when he really started to begin this process. He was nervous but excited, and really it came out of his experience as a grandparent. Now, I just want to say this. I think the listeners that are here as ministers on staff, they've got a couple of different things they're trying to accomplish. Number one, they're age-graded ministers. They're wanting to connect to the students that they serve. Then they're wanting to support and love the family. They're also looking for great volunteers that'll give influence. Then they're just, in general, looking for people to support and encourage their ministry. In all of those categories, grandparents are such amazing candidates for that kind of help and encouragement and support to your ministry. They have time.
That's right.
They typically have resources.
That's right.
They are available, and there's a developmental need in a grandparent. It's time for them to give back, to mentor. There's a recognition, hey, I don't have much time left.
That's
I
right.
want to give back. Is there not a better candidate
That's
for a
right.
volunteer? So those are my thoughts on grandparent ministry.
I
Guys,
agree.
It's an untapped resource for most of us. And what do you think about grandparent ministry, Ron?
Well, Larry says it so well, and here's the deal. You've got to say this multiple times to your congregation, multiple times to your seniors group to get them to stop thinking about themselves as seniors, but to think about themselves as grandparents, even if they don't have grandkids in the church. You said it well. I mean, what other group of people have watched the young people grow through the stages of life, not once with their own children, but usually twice with their grandchildren, times the number of kids and grandkids they have. They know what these kids are thinking. They know what they're struggling with, and they are usually better at encouraging them than anyone else. Parents are usually great at correcting. Grandparents are great at encouraging, but they speak powerful words of inspiration into their grandkids' lives or other people's grandkids' lives. And you said it well. They've got the time to do it.
Larry taught me the average grandparent is the average age of a grandparent was somewhere in their 40s, which was amazing to me to think that they are so young. But most of the time, they are way more involved in the raising of the kids than we want to realize. And that's another reason we want to engage them.
So that's why they want to, when you think about that stat in the church being in their 40s, those parents that are just now newly grandparents in their 40s, they don't think of themselves as seniors. They think of themselves as grandparents and wear that tag proudly. But you put the label of senior on them, no way. So energize those grandparents. Get them involved. No better thing you can do for your church than that.
And there's so many issues they face. They need the same kind of support that we offer parents. I was having breakfast with a grandparent yesterday, and he was talking to me about his passion to teach his grandkids about money and money management. And he said, sometimes I'm the bad guy, and I don't know how to be the bad guy as a grandparent because you're supposed to always be the good guy. But in training them, I'm sometimes the bad guy. How do I deal with that? I went to the grocery store the other day, talked to a grandmother who is kind of co-parenting with her daughter who had a child at a young age. And she was talking about, I'm fatigued. I'm tired. I am dealing with, I had expectations for this stage of my life and those haven't been met. And I've got a whole new journey.
That's right.
But at the same time, they bring so much life to me and the balance of all that. I guess I just want to, what I'm trying to do, Ron, between the two of us here is I'm trying to inspire people to take this seriously. There's so much opportunity in grandparent ministry.
You know, whether you take the Richard Ross, the 1/3, where parents and grandparents are very involved in the church in other people's kids' lives, or whether or not you take Chap Clark's adoptive view, where grandparents not only adopt each other peer level, but they adopt downward to young marrieds who they can develop or to grandkids. The point is, do not marginalize that older group of people. That's the key. And don't let them feel entitled. Let them feel challenged to pour back into others. That's what Jeremy and I are trying to state to every one of you.
Yes, a little bonus there to our podcast today. This might be our longest podcast episode ever, but who cares because it was good. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We sure did. Remember, every Tuesday we try to drop these episodes. You can circle it on your calendar and look for it, and you'll find it every Tuesday. The D6 Podcast, we are here to serve you. We always want to hear from you. You can look on Twitter at D6Leader, and you can find us there. You can use the hashtag D6 Podcast. You can email ron.hunter@randallhouse.com. There's lots of ways to connect with us. We just want to connect with you and learn from you and hear from you what you'd like to hear on this podcast. We look forward to that. We're excited for next week when we're going to have a great friend of D6, Brian Haynes, and then another great friend of D6, Amy Reno. What a great lineup. We'll look forward to that. See you guys next week. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com. And if you're a minister, we invite you to join the D6 Leader Network by going to d6leadernetwork.com.